just onto a brief introduction and welcome. As I said, my name's Brett Thielen. I'm with the Harris Center for Conservation Education. If you are new to us, we are a land trust and environmental education organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire. And we help people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, and education of all ages. So if you are local to us, I know there's a lot of New Hampshire folks out there. I always like to share that we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development, and much of that is open for hiking or birding or other recreation. We coordinate conservation research projects on our protected lands and really throughout the region through a variety of really fun community science projects. And then at the heart of everything we do is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between, including a really incredible calendar of events every year, from everything from guided hikes and paddles to film showings and talks like this one. So I know we have some Harris Center supporters out there. I always like to thank you for making all of this possible. And if you're new to us, you can learn more about us at harriscenter.org. Is to introduce Joan Walsh of Mass Audubon. Joan is the Gerard Bertrand Chair of Natural History and Field Ornithology at Mass Audubon, and she's here to share, in honor of Women's History Month, a really remarkable tale of women who made a difference in science back before they even had the right to vote in this country, and not just science, but conservation as well. So thank you all for being here, and Joan, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. And I always like to do this talk. It helps to connect me to the people whose shoulders I stand on, basically. I thought that when I got into this business, that it was fairly easy to just be and do be what you wanted to be. And it turns out that it hasn't always been that way. And in the 1970s, there had been a lot of people who paved the way, and they started paving the way a very long time ago. I'm going to turn my video off because I hate to look at myself while I talk. I mean, just in general, I'm so sick of seeing myself on Zoom. So if nobody minds, I'm going to do that. And we'll work through this. I happen to work at an organization that is pivotal in the role that women have played in advancing conservation. And at that time, when Mass Audubon was founded in 1896, we have to sort of time travel back to where we were. We're post-Civil War, we're pre-World War I. We're the Industrial Revolution in full swing, Jim Crow in full swing in the South. Black men, Black women, very few rights in the Southern United States. White women don't have the right to vote as well. White men are basically making all the decisions, holding all of the property. Very, very difficult to imagine the social changes that needed to occur to bring a conservation ethic into that sort of atmosphere. So I just want you to sort of drift back to that time. If anyone's watching The Gilded Age on HBO, allow yourself back there. We're going to be talking about a lot of upper crust women. These were women of means because, of course, those were the only people who had time to contemplate something like caring about too many ducks being killed or too many herons and egrets being killed, right? So you need to put on a few visors, a few blinders, or put on your virtual reality and try and time travel back. The air is filled with smoke. Smokestacks are belching all manner of crap all over everyone. Electricity is still extraordinarily rare. There really aren't cars. Everything's still horse and buggy. So take yourself back there a little bit. There we go. And we're going to talk a little bit about Harriet Hemingway. We'll get back to her at the end, but this is always a grounding slide for me. Harriet Hemingway and her cousin Minna Hall were the two people who founded Mass Audubon Society, which was the name of it at the time. It's still our formal name. We go by Mass Audubon. This is Harriet. Harriet was quite an iconoclast. She was upper crust, Boston Brahmin. Her father was an abolitionist, a staunch abolitionist, someone who put his money where his mouth was. His last name was Lawrence. He founded Lawrence, Kansas, with free soilers. When Kansas was going to be admitted to the Union, they got to vote whether they would be hold enslaved people or not. And there was a move from the East Coast of the United States to actually settle Kansas, to build towns and settle parts of Kansas with people who would vote for Kansas to be entered as a free state. And one of those towns is Lawrence, Kansas. And that was a town that was bought by Harriet's father. He also settled Florence, Massachusetts. Yeah, what? Did I just see you say, oh, what? My God, look up free soiler. You learned about it in high school. You probably forgot. It is an incredible legacy. That's who her father was. So Harriet had some, there was free thought in Harriet's family. This is a painting by John Singer Sargent. Oh my God, can you imagine being able to have John Singer Sargent paint your family portraits, right? And she's announcing that she's pregnant, and she's doing that with this water lily flower. And it was totally racy in its time. It was like the talk of Boston when she announced that. There are no photographs or paintings of Minna Hall. So this is, often you see this in another image that I'll show you at the end of Harriet Hemingway. And Harriet and Minna started Mass Audubon basically because they were outraged. They were outraged, and they were probably outraged about an awful lot of things. And so I want to build the story a little bit to what got them into that feeling, where they were willing to risk their social position for birds, which is an incredible thing. So I just wanted to ground us a little bit with this image of Harriet, and then move us on to John James Audubon, right? You really can't start talking about the conservation movement in the United States of America unless you start talking about Wilson or Audubon. Audubon's history is now I can't take a hard right here, or we're going to be here till 10 o'clock tonight if we start talking about Audubon's history. And it's another great topic to dig into. Audubon made and lost fortunes 3 or 4 times in his life. Audubon entered the United States on a forged passport. It's not exactly clear who Audubon's mother was. Audubon's father was a slaver in Haiti. And that's where Audubon's first fortune came from. Him and his sister were sent to France to live with Audubon's first wife, who raised them. And then to avoid the draft, he came to the United States on a forged passport. If to his credit, he managed to notice someone named Lucy, who sort of stabilized him for a lot of his life. And at about age 35, Audubon begins finally his life's work, which is what we know, which is the Birds of America. And when I say that Audubon made and lost fortunes multiple times, that's not an overstatement. I wrote something for Mass Audubon 2 years ago about a historic reckoning, which we're still going through, all of the Audubons are going through, about the casual cruelty that John James Audubon used with his enslaved people. He got into a crazy steamboat scheme along the way, where he was going to have the steamboat and it was going to make him lots of money. And it turns out that before he could get investors, someone stole the steamboat. So he says, "Well, I'm gonna find them." And he floats down the Ohio River, merges with the Mississippi, goes all the way down to New Orleans, and he never finds the stolen steamboat, which is sort of amusing if you think about it. I'm not sure sure where you had a steamboat, but he couldn't find the steamboat. But he made this trip with two enslaved people, chattel slavery. He owned them lock, stock, and barrel. And to pay his way back, he sold them in New Orleans. This was not uncommon at the time for middle class, upper class people. It's a story that people have known about Audubon, but people don't tell this story about Audubon. We tell a different story about him. And I want to recognize his role in conservation, building the conservation movement. And I have to spend a lot of time thinking about the role. When I did the work on this, I spent a year thinking and learning about the role that the enslaved people in the United States did to build our entire economy. We built the United States economy and money that we still have on the role of the on the enslaved people. So that's another talk. We can continue going down that another time. But right now, I want to reel in to the thing that Audubon is known for, which is his Birds of America, where he spent about 15 years traveling the United States, what was then the United States, and collecting birds and painting birds, selling subscriptions. And most of those subscriptions went to Europe, where people in Europe then opened their eyes to this. It put flesh on the bones of how they viewed the United States as this great landscape filled with wildlife, right? And then you did the quadrupeds, where you showed them all of the four-legged mammals in the United States. So this is what you're typically used to seeing when we all grew up and looked at Audubon prints. They were these small, crappy prints. There was a lot of blur and blub in them. They weren't all that exciting. But when you look at the originals, and when you look at the originals close up, what do you see? You see drama, you see beauty, it's power, it's storytelling. He was the David Attenborough of his time. This was who Audubon was. Here's chipmunks coming in with two barn owls. And this, for people in Europe, they were way ahead of us at killing their wildlife. They really had nothing left. This is like people going to another planet, being able to see this. Look at this bird's face and their eyes. Stunning portraiture. Just stunning portraiture. And it opened people's eyes in the United States. Many libraries purchased these, and people began to think of wildlife as from a more magical way. And it really started to have a discussion form around kernels of conservation. It took 20 years for that to happen. These are bison skulls from Texas. This is a photo out of Hornaday's book. Hornaday is another person we could talk about for an awful long time. And I have some more issues, some more items from Hornaday coming up, but I really want to recognize that Hornaday was a very, I can't believe the things he got away with in his life. He was a meticulous record keeper. He's the reason that we know how many feathers were sold on the London Feather Auction. At the same time, when Hornaday was the president at the Bronx Zoo, he actually put a human in a cage and in an exhibit, a pygmy native from Africa. Rough sledding. The guy's rough sledding is what I can say about that. His book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, was a pivotal document that put data down for how the scale to which the Industrial Revolution was eating, shooting, and killing all of the animals in the countryside. There is no other document that we have to go to, really, that summarizes as well as he did. And this comes from Hornaday as well, and it's an Audubon painting at the bottom of Passenger Pigeon. And I know no one likes to read slides, but let me just give you 30 seconds for you to read this and let these numbers sink in. This is passenger pigeons in Michigan. This happens in the 1860s. In 40 days, one town in Michigan, 12 million passenger pigeons. They can do this because refrigeration has been invented. In another Michigan town, close to 16 million in 2 years. All of these pigeons are going to Chicago, Boston, New York, to Louisiana, to New Orleans, to any industrial center that they can get them to. They're going there, and they're the fuel. They're the fuel that the humans are eating for the Industrial Revolution. And we know how the passenger pigeon story ends. They managed to kill almost all of the passenger pigeons by about 1890. But the real thing that galvanizes the conservation movement is the millinery trade. And this is a woman wearing a bird of paradise on her hat. Very common. As you go through, you can go online and you can look at images in any of the Collier's or Saturday Evening Post or any of the old magazines from the 1870s, 1860s, and you'll see lots of these types of images. And I think at the beginning, there was someone from British Columbia who had signed on to this talk. I think in Vancouver, there is a museum of fashion, and they actually have a lot of hats. They have a lot of these hats because a lot of them disintegrated and were not protected. And I've gotten a fair amount of information from talks out of that museum, and have always meant to go there to look at it. This was not uncommon. Middle-class women, upper-class women. This was your social signaling. This was part of your identity. This was how you showed not only could you have a well-made hat, but then you could start to ornament it. Hats used to be ornamented. It was really serious social signaling. Hats were ornamented with beads, sequins. They were quite elaborate. And then people started to discover that ornamenting with first just single feathers and then wings, and then it moved on to having whole birds, and it moved on to full tableaus with multiple birds and sticks in people's hats that told whole stories. There are some outrageous pictures out there that you can find of some of these hats that have been preserved. But for each of these hats that was put together, first of all, you can make the assumption that many more birds were killed than the feathers than had usable feathers, right? So at the numbers that you're going to see coming up on the screen, if it says that 8,000 eagles were killed for eagle parts in hats. Now, eagles are really big. I'm not even sure what part of an eagle you put in your hat. It's a crazy construct, but you can imagine it was probably, 12,000 eagles, because you damage all the feathers when you shot them or killed them. And this comes to the forefront. Frank Chapman brings this to the forefront when he does a walk in 1886, about 10 years before Mass Audubon is founded. And he does a 2-day walk. He works at the American Museum of Natural History, another super interesting guy. He's the chair of ornithology at the American Museum of Natural History, and is pretty outraged by this new trend with a lot of birds on hats. And he does a 2-day walk in Central Park, and he finds 40 different species represented with 174 birds on people's hats in that short time. And he puts that in Field and Stream. That information makes Field and Stream. Field and Stream at that point is a very influential magazine. And it's been started by the Boone and Crockett Club is instrumental in getting it started. Teddy Roosevelt's in that gang. This is a men's club. They're interested in stopping the bison kills. They're interested in stopping overhunting because many of them want to hunt recreationally, and they still want there to be bison. So the Boone and Crockett Club really start to talk about revolutionary stuff like limiting seasons on when animals can be hunted, things like that, pretty revolutionary stuff. Grinnell is involved in that. Roosevelt is involved in that. And Grinnell goes on, Grinnell's also in New York City. Grinnell goes on to create this sweet little magazine named after John James Audubon. This is number one, and it's in the 1880s that he publishes it. And he really quickly gets a whole lot of people to sign on to his Audubon Society. Unfortunately, for reasons that I've never really been able to figure out, whether he lost interest or whether it wasn't financially viable, but he had a lot of people as members, it stopped publishing. But you can see at this point, even in the 1880s, there's a machine is chugging forward. This conservation ethic is starting to build. There's starting to be talks about limits on how many ducks you can kill, what season you can kill ducks in. There's almost no birds left. There's almost no deer left. There's almost no bison left. So there's this grinding and creaking machine moving forward, trying to build this ethic, and they're really not sure how to do that. In 1889, this slide is out of order. I apologize for that. This is 2 years after Harriet and Minna get started. The Plumage League gets started, which turns into the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in England. And it's built on the same tenet as Mass Audubon is. Members are going to discourage wanton destruction of birds, and you will not wear birds with the exception of ostriches. And I always think those poor ostriches, they really got hung out to dry there. Of all the birds in the world, of the 8,000 species in the world, the ostriches really got hung out to dry there. But put a pin in this, you move this slide down a little bit more. This became something that high fashion Harper's Bazaar had to comment on, that there should be an owl or ostrich left with a single feather apiece hardly seems possible. This is the scale to which feathers are being traded and worn. From 1901 to 1910, 37 million birds are killed. These are numbers from our man Hornaday. The feather trade, there was a Paris feather auction. There was a London feather auction. There was a small one in the United States, but the London feather auction was the big one. And they kept meticulous records, and those were the records that Hornaday went through to generate this information. So as I said it earlier on, tableaus of parakeets over on the left, an a grebe muff. That's the muff up on the top in the center is made out of grebe feathers, and Mass Audubon happens to have one. And I wasn't supposed to, but I put my hands inside of it one day, and it was incredible. It was warmer than any down you've ever put your hands inside of. And birds of paradise. And the tableau on the bottom right is like a bunch of duck wings and then a bird of paradise tossed on top of it. Fashion, I guess, does not always translate across the decades. In the London Feather House in 1892, there was a single order placed there that included 6,000 birds of paradise, 6,000. To go to one milliner. They wanted to use 40,000 hummingbirds and 360,000, various East Indian birds, stuff that I guess that they would just fill in the spots with. And this is from Punch, the comic, A Bird of Prey. This woman dressed with talons on her feet, dressed as a bird of prey, taking this kingfisher out with the egret in the background preening. So what do we know about the London Feather House? We know in 1902 they sold enough feathers of gray heron that it would have taken 193,000 gray herons to meet the feather needs in 1902 alone. Now, remember what I said, for each bird, probably more birds were killed than actually turned into feathers, because the feathers would be damaged on some of them. And typically they were only taking from egrets and herons, they were only taking the long nuptial plumes off of the back and leaving the rest. In some cases, they would shoot them typically they would shoot them in the nesting colonies, and then all the young would die as well, because there would be no one there to feed them. In 1911, 130,000 great egret feathers were traded in the London feather auction. 1911. Now, this is long after Harriet and Minna formed Mass Audubon, right? In 1896. It took a long time to get this to stop. 6,000 eagle feathers. 1911, 20,000 birds of paradise. This was the annual rate that they were ticking over. This went on for 30 or 40 years. Single lots of hummingbirds, 1,600 hummingbirds sold at 2 cents each. This is the thing that made Harriet and Minna risk their social standing. They saw this happening in 1896. They were people, as I said at the beginning, who probably had an awful lot of things to be angry about. But in this particular case, this was made flesh and blood right in front of them at every meeting that they ever went to. Their friends were there with hats covered with feathers. And they were willing to force that change. They made the change. Many of you probably already know this story, by simply taking down the blue book. First of all, you'll hear them described as socialites. They were not socialites. They were revolutionaries. Let's just be clear. They risked almost everything for this. They were supported in their families, which is the one thing that's very different about many other people who may have been outraged by the same thing. And they were supported by their families. They took down the blue book of the Boston Brahmins, and they started to call people and ask them to come for tea. And the people would come and sit down for tea, and they would say, sign this, say you'll join our society, say you will not wear feathers, and say that you will help spread the word. And it took on like wildfire. From Mass Audubon's founding, within 1 year, there were more than 100 chapters in Massachusetts alone, something like 160 chapters within 1 year, 105 of them headed by women. This was in hands on their hips, we've had enough. This was we've had enough. This was an organizing tool that helped women also go on to continue organizing for suffrage, and in some cases also for prohibition. Right? This was a galvanizing tool. Through this comes Mabel Osgood Wright, the founder of Connecticut Audubon, who also, I just learned this today. I knew that Mabel had started Connecticut Audubon, but she was the president of National Audubon from 1905 to 28. She was like their second president. I did not know that. Amazing. Mass Audubon's first president. So Minna and Harriet got us started, and then the two of them said, we need a man to run the organization. And Brewster came and ran the organization, but not Mabel. Mabel took it on, and then she moved right up. This is another person who you should know, and this is Florence Marian Bailey. And Florence, you'll often hear about Wilson, you'll hear about Audubon. They didn't really write field guides. When you look at the illustrations that Florence did, they really were the first field guide. She really took birds apart and showed you differences in bill structure between species to help people identify individual species. And, I've never really heard her credited with being the creator of the first field guide. I've got friends in that business, and I think I'm going to start talking to them about about somebody really doing some deeper research and finding out if that's correct. Because and if there's any, I think that there's maybe some young people on the line from Lab Girl. I think this woman could really be worth learning an awful lot more about, because she's kind of buried in there. But I think she was pivotal, and she did illustrations for years. She kept going her whole life. She did scientific illustrations. Really interesting person. And the sun is setting in Aruba. When I come back on, it's going to be fairly dark. I'm going to take a risk and turn on a light and see what I look like when we turn the camera back on. Margaret Morse, nice. Now, this is Margaret looking at a song sparrow nest. Margaret wrote a monograph, which is a single species in-depth study about song sparrows. Margaret was from Amherst, Massachusetts. The foreword to her book, Research is My Passion. The foreword to her book is written by Konrad Lorenz, who is considered the father of behavioral ecology. But really, he credits her with it. So she's another person who's gotten buried. Konrad gets all the credit. Konrad was the guy with the gulls. He's really worth knowing about. He did really good work with birds. But he credits her with starting the field, not him. She's also worth learning about. And then Rosalie Barrow Edge. Now, there's another thing here. I don't know if you've caught on yet. Everybody has three names because many people are carrying along their maiden name, and they don't want to bury their maiden name. Many of these women are carrying their maiden names along with them, so that heritage is also known. And this brings us to Harriet's legacy and Minna's legacy. Harriet lived to be 102 years old. I have met someone who is her great-grandson and said she was incredibly grumpy, which I really like about her, because she clearly had enough. Even when she was in her 20s, she had enough that she was willing to risk it all to start a society to get people to stop killing birds and for there to be some reasonable restrictions on what we were doing to wildlife. Did it work? Did it make a difference? Did these people, did the early conservationists make a difference? Oh yeah, they did. There wouldn't be herons and egrets if there had been another 15 years of shooting. By the time we ended up really stopping the feather trade, which really stopping it really was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. About 10 years before that, Weeks McLean Act stopped the interstate transport of feathers, and that slowed it down. But there were very few herons and egrets left, only in some isolated places in Florida, as well as on the McElhenney Preserve in Louisiana. If that rings a bell to anybody, put it in the chat. And the first person to be able to identify, because it still exists, the McElhenney Preserve in Louisiana. What do they make? What do the McElhenneys make? They make a condiment that everybody knows and has used, and it was a wildlife refuge, and that was where the last remaining herons and egrets were nesting in Louisiana. They wouldn't let shooters onto their property. So did it work? Yeah, it worked. And people like the McElhenneys, it worked. They helped to make it work. It was by the 1940s, there was only 1,000 nests of great egret in Florida, just 1,000. There's way more piping plovers in Massachusetts than that. There's way more. There's more roseate terns in Massachusetts than that. And now there's about 7,000 pairs in Florida. It's actually, that's an estimate from about 10 years ago. There hasn't been every decade there's a waterfowl, a long-legged wading bird survey, and I think it got held up by COVID. It did work. We have herons and egrets now because of this. There's almost no doubt that they would have gotten almost all of the birds of paradise, which were really sought after. The idea that any single person can't make a difference is bunk. That's really your first takeaway. And it's never too late to start making a difference. These were people in their 30s, in their 40s, even older. It's never too late to see something that's wrong and go to work at trying to make it right. And this is a living example of women who had money, but they had no power. They really couldn't own property. They couldn't vote. They couldn't work in the job of their choice. They had very little power. And they were able to see something wrong and make it right. Now, they were not perfect. There were many things that were wrong that they did not make right. We have to acknowledge that as well. But every time you see a common tern fly by or a roseate tern fly by, every time that you see a heron or an egret fly by, anytime that you have an opportunity to see a bunch of ducks come into a roost at night, these are people that you can thank, because from this sprung the most revolutionary concept, which is that wildlife deserves to be protected. And up until this moment, that was not the case. So I think I'll leave it there so we have a little bit of time for questions. And Zoom is very odd. You can't tell like if everyone's left or if you called Harriet Hemingway by the wrong name the whole time, there's no one in the audience to help you. But I also just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that I know this is a really difficult time with the state of the world. I have good friends who have been able to get their parents out of Ukraine, and there's probably people who have not, who are here. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I don't mean to be flippant about anything I'm saying. My heart is with you.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was really amazing and full of information that I want to go back and study a little bit better. Does anyone have, if you have questions, anyone who's in the audience, if you could put them in the chat and we will share them with Joan. While we're waiting, I guess I have a question thinking about, today and your work at Audubon and the women that you work with, the scientists there. And I guess I'm wondering what you see as what the challenges are that are still faced by women in conservation, if there's anything, or, if there's anything that comes to mind, like between then and now, like where are we now?
So, the world of conservation science, and in particular, the world of academia is really no place that Me Too was alive and well. Let's just be clear about that, and you can see it in all the statistics that we see with women entering into PhD programs, getting PhDs conferred, and then the rate of tenure. They lose a lot of that advantage by the time that they're tenured because women have children. So from an academic perspective, I see a 1,000,000-mile gap there that needs to be closed. I see, in particular, many of the young people who I'm working with, who are interested in conservation science, behavioral ecology, because I do a fair amount of that, as well as conservation science. Many of them are women, and they bring a very different approach than men do. That is always really refreshing to me. I love working with, I work with students from both University of Connecticut and this year, one of the projects I'm on, University of Rhode Island, will have students as well. My approach, and this, I'm really old. I was born when rocks were soft. My approach had been head down, just go. head down, just go, head down, just go. And when I look back, I see that there were so many opportunities that were not available to me. And don't take it. Don't take it. If you think an opportunity is close to you because of gender or color, don't take it. Be Minna, be Harriet. If you see something that's not right, if you haven't been in an airport lately, they're still saying it. If you see something, say something. So I see great strides on when many of you probably know the Endurance was found within the last few days, right? Shackleton's ship, right? Anybody could have gone out and tried to find the Endurance, but it was found by a South African icebreaker research boat, the Agulhas 2. And it happens to be a boat that I follow because I'm really interested in polar work. And I happen to follow this boat. And there is on YouTube, I couldn't find it before I started this talk. I'll try and find it and send it, and maybe we can send it out to people. There's something that encapsulates women working in science about that. And sort of the chief engineer, the person who did a lot of the engineering to find that boat, there's a YouTube video of her holding up the South African flag, and she's nearly in tears. And she's pronouncing to the world that they found the Endurance. And if that doesn't move you to the power of science and discovery and what women can bring to that, and it's okay to have emotion. It's okay for her to feel that. It's okay for her to feel that power and that wonder, because that's where discovery lies. So I guess that's a long-winded answer to how do I feel? That woman encapsulates it for me. She does. She encapsulates it for me. She's got it all. She got it going on. And she found the freaking Endurance.
Thank you, Joan. That's really, we'll find that YouTube, and maybe we can send it out with the recording so people can of this talk, so people can see that really amazing moment. So there are some questions that have come in the meantime, more historic questions, I guess I would say, which I'll pass along. The first one is from Elaine. She said, when these folks did drawings of the birds, did they kill them? If so, how did they square that with their conservation efforts?
Audubon there was no need for him to square that. It wasn't in his intellect, not intellect. It wasn't in his, there's got to be a social scientist out there who would be able to help me with the phrase. He was, well, first of all, he's eating a lot of animals, right? So that's something that's going on all the time. He can't do drawings without seeing the birds up close. So for him, in order to achieve his goal, he has to shoot the bird. He has to shoot the bird to do it. And it's the scale that bothers him. He's actually, he's sort of starting to get it. He feels, Audubon, when you read his journals, there's a lot in there that, well, first of all, he's a showman, and a lot of it's probably made up. There's this whole made up story about it seems like it's a made up story about some runaway enslaved people. So you really can't tell about him, but it stops very shortly after that. Once people figure out binoculars. So most of the field, like Peterson, did not shoot birds. He's really the next big thing. Not Mabel Osgood, right? The woman a few slides back, she didn't shoot birds either. So yeah, different times, different ethics. And the question of scale, I think, is how they did it.
There are people who are interested in learning more about some of the figures you've mentioned. So Kathy's wondering if there's a biography of Mabel Osgood Wright, and Marcy's wondering about resources for learning more about Harriet and Minna, if there's anything that you can recommend.
There's tons of information about Harriet and Minna. That's a pretty quick Google, and just dig into that. Mabel Osgood Wright, I don't know that anyone's done a biography, but where I would start is she was a fellow in the AOU. I would start with her obituary, the AOU.
For those of us who might not know that.
Sorry. The American Ornithologists Union obituary. So when I've done work trying to dig out information on these women, no, single biographies, no. You'll find it on Conrad Lorenz, though. This is, I just wonder, there is one on the woman who started Hawk Mountain. I've never read it. I've just done sort of my own independent work for that. One of Scott Weidensol's books has a chapter on women in conservation. And that I think you might be able to find in an open source as well. So I can't point you to any single place.
Okay. And there was another question. Someone asked about Margaret Morse Nice, what you thought was the most interesting part of her life or work. This is a question from Olivia.
Yeah, so I really got into her right at the beginning of the pandemic. I did a bunch of videos for Mass Audubon from my yard. I was stuck in my house in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and my son was there, who is an actor, he would do voiceovers on these videos. We'd write a script. We'd spend a day doing research, and then we'd write a script. And we shot them all on iPhones. And then he would do voiceovers. They're still on the Mass Audubon website, and they're called like A Bird a Day or something. And I did one on her, and I just couldn't stop researching her. So song sparrows, right? Super common bird, smart thing for her to study, right? You don't want to, if you're not going to be going far to do your research or do work on a colonial bird, right? She's going to do something that's right in her front yard. Like the woman who's working on squirrels, who's going to come and do a talk. Super smart thing to study. That's like, right? Squirrels are as interesting as anything else, right? And she went, and she was the first person to do this, went and looked at overlapping territories of the song sparrows in fields and marked the nest and watched and learned how the birds behaved, learned about feeding rates, learned about breeding displays. She actually put their whole life history together. And she did it in a way that really hadn't been done before. And she did it for a bird that, she found a way to do that, and still she was just doing it in her backyard. Sort of. So the way that she looked at the animals from a different perspective, and the way that she actually looked at them as societal creatures was what really struck me as the most interesting thing about her work. Really flipping everything on its head instead of just, a cold, cruel, sorry, somebody just texted me. Cold, cruel animals, don't let any emotion in. So that was something that I really liked about her.
Wonderful. Thank you. So there's one last question, which is from Harriet and Stephen. They're wondering about why feathers. Why were feathers chosen as an adornment? Is there, or have you read anything about that?
Well, I mean, you can look back historically, right? I mean, if you look, if anyone has been to the Amazon, to Iquitos, to do an Amazon boat trip to look at birds, there's a wonderful museum there where they have some preserved scarlet macaw whole body dresses that were worn by chiefs in the Amazon. They're really reminiscent of, you can see where the Mardi Gras Indian outfits come from when you look at these traditional Amazon native dress, full body feathers. People have been adorning themselves with feathers for millennia that we know of, right? If you think back to it, in African cultures, in Southeast Asian cultures, in Native American cultures, all over the world. So it's interesting, and that's a good question. Why feathers? Why feathers? Why not fish scales? Stinky. I'm vacationing in Aruba, and right now, and it's really a festival of everyone walking around adorned with real interesting tattoos, as well as a lot of body ink, and a lot of beachwear. Right? We still are signaling it's just slightly different way who we are, and it was a fashion that caught like wildfire, and you can look back at, you can imagine if you think back millennia, why would a chief of a tribe want to dress in scarlet macaw? Well, they can fly, right? Right? Birds can fly, and there's magic in that, right? Out in the world, there aren't that many things that fly. And you can still look at that with real wonder and magic. And I think about that when I think about when we go back historically with humans adorning themselves with feathers. But why does it suddenly take hold in 1880? I don't know. It's expensive. And so it's social signaling. I'm showing you who I am because I can afford 2 birds of paradise on my hat. Oh, I can afford 3. It's a social signaling thing.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Joan. This was riveting. We're so grateful for your time and expertise and for sharing it with us, even while you're on vacation. So thank you so much, Joan. And
well, thank you for
all
having
of
me.
us for joining us. And till next time.